You're listening to a download from the outdoorstation.co.uk. Number 508.
Hello and welcome back to the Outdoors Station, the longest running podcast in the world dedicated to outdoor adventures of all kinds involving self-powered travel. I'm your host, Bob Cartwright, and this is part 2 of my fascinating conversation with Anna Blackwell. In part 1, on podcast number 507, we spoke of Anna's solo hikes along the King's Trail in Sweden and the Green Ribbon in Scandinavia. The conversation continues here, and Anna shares the story of her 4,000-kilometre tandem kayak with her friend Kate from London to the Black Sea. Please check out her website, annablackwell.co.uk, for further details and pictures, or drop by theoutdoorstation.co.uk and look at the show notes. While you're there, perhaps you might like to join our newsletter to help us find new adventurers to speak with.
Yeah, so my friend Kate and I, as you said, tandem kayaked. We had a double kayak called Benji. We paddled from London to the Black Sea in Romania, which was through 11 countries and 5 capital cities across Europe. And through the trip, we were raising money for Pancreatic Cancer Action in memory of Kate's dad. It's worth saying, actually, that Kate and I met online to do this trip. We met through a website called Explorers Connect, which is essentially an expedition adventure teammate finding platform. And I saw her advert and replied to it. And bizarrely, it turned out we'd gone to the same school and lived a couple of miles apart. So we spent 5 months in a kayak, wild camping for a long time, living off lots and lots of pasta pesto, going through, I think, over 200 locks, paddling alongside 300 meter long barges, having a fantastic time, also overcoming a lot of things like kit breaking, both of us getting ill. I ended up on a drip in Serbia, but a truly fantastic trip. And we met so many incredible people. I think the best bit from that trip was just the amount of hospitality and generosity that we received through every single country, in towns and cities and villages, and in the middle of nowhere, just people would appear and help us.
Now, I know this was sponsored and it also was raising money for charity, and you did exceedingly well in doing so. I think I heard somewhere, was it 5,000 was your target and 50,000 was what you raised in total?
Yeah, when we first set out, or when we first started talking about it, we thought £5,000 was a realistic goal. And I think our total was 58,000 in the end, which, yeah, we're still blown away by that.
Yeah, well done, well done. Now, the kayaking sounds fantastic, tandem kayaking, and it is a big boat when you actually look at the pictures and see how long it is. Crossing the channel is one thing, and I know you've been asked about this before, and it actually wasn't as bad as everybody, myself included, would assume it was. But the part about crossing the channel, which I wanted to ask you, was you had a support boat with you. Is that like a maritime law that you must have a support boat doing this, or was that something you chose to do for your own personal safety?
No, you have to have a support boat. And actually we were very happy to, because it meant that we didn't have to worry about the navigation or the tides or anything like that. We had them booked for we had a window of a week to make the crossing, and they would keep an eye on the conditions and the weather forecast, and they'd let us know which the best day would be to do the crossing. And then we met them at the harbour and they led us across, and all we had to do was paddle. It was still 5.5 hours, but yeah, had them with us the whole way.
That's quicker than some ferry crossings. I think you've done well there. As I say, you were sponsored and had support, and you had a PR company, I think, giving you a bit of advance publicity in various places. Did you find that helped open any doors when you went through Europe?
I don't know if it did actually. They sort of helped us arrange some interviews along the way. So we had the BBC following us. So we had a couple of interviews with them, sort of Skype video interviews. But actually, a lot of the support we got was more in situ, and it was just us turning up in this huge kayak, looking very out of place, because often we were sort of the only kayak that would use that waterway, and explaining what we were doing and trying to persuade people that yes, we had actually come all the way from London, and yes, we had crossed the channel. And at that point, people would be so surprised by what we were doing that they would just try to help us however they could. So yeah, a lot of the sport was just through shock and confusion.
The canals that you went on, the rivers you went on, they're big. I mean, they're commercial waterways, and the barges are huge. And by comparison, your boat was very, very little. And the few times I've been over there and seen them, generally the sides of the canals are concrete slopes, which are not very easy to get up or down. So I presume you had a bit of trouble with portage and getting the boat out to get round the locks or any associated obstacles at all.
Yeah, that was challenging. That was mainly a problem in France and Belgium. So in the first 2 months of it, we made very slow progress on the canals, partly because actually the logistics of it was hard. Portaging, getting around the locks took a very long time because we would have to, find places where we could get out of the kayak, but also where we could get the kayak out of the water. Without any of our kit, our food, our water in the kayak, it weighed 40 kilos and it's about seven meters long, I think. So he's really hard to get out of the water, and we'd have to empty everything out onto the bank before we could get him up. And then he would go onto a pair of wheels. Sorry, I realised I refer to the kayak as a he. He is called Benji. He was like the third member of our team. He's essentially a living thing to us. So we would have to put Benji onto a set of wheels and push him around with all of our kit. And those wheels broke on us 4 or 5 times just from the weight of everything. And it was incredibly frustrating. We ended up having to camp in some really grim places by sort of towpaths and industrial estates and on the outskirts of cities. But after the first couple of months, while we were in France, we were given permission to kayak through the locks, which really, really sped things up. At the same time, it was very terrifying. In Germany, some of the locks they're some of the deepest in Europe. They're about 25 meters deep and a couple of 100 meters long. When you're sitting in the bottom of that in a little kayak, it can get a little bit scary.
From a security point of view, I understand obviously the practicalities of when you are portaging something particularly that size and that weight, you are ping-ponging back and forward. So somebody has to stay with the boat, the other person has to go back and get the gear, then they come back and then back and forward or whatever. Did you find you went through 11 countries and I think you pretty well wild camped apart from when you were offered accommodation by people who took sympathy on you. Did you find that the hardest part, the portage and the worry about security of your gear, or camping and wild camping by the side of the canal? Was that more of a worry for you?
I think it was on and off in the first few weeks. When we were sort of right by the canal and there were sort of boats going past a lot of the time and we were quite obvious, it was a bit more nerve-wracking, but actually we settled into it really, really fast. And with the exception of one set of wheels getting stolen from a very family-oriented campsite that we were at, nothing else got stolen. We ran into no trouble whatsoever with people. Interestingly, before we went, quite a few people this was something that people were really, really worried about, us being vulnerable as 2 girls wild camping with a lot of equipment. So obviously we had money supporting us. And people were particularly worried about the further east and Romania and Serbia, the poorer countries. They thought, we would be putting ourselves at an unnecessary risk going through those countries. We tended to ignore that because those people generally hadn't travelled through these countries and we wanted to go with an open mind. And actually going through those countries was some of the most rewarding parts that we paddled through. In Serbia, we had these Serbian fishermen rescue us from a really horrific headwind, and they cooked us a huge breakfast, and then we ended up getting a little bit drunk with them on rakia, which is homebrewed spirits. And in Romania, when we were on the Danube, again we met some fantastic locals and had an evening with them, drinking chilled ciders and watching the sunset and learning about sort of fishing. So actually being able to travel through those places with an open mind, we were rewarded for it fantastically.
Well, once again, I'm sure listeners now will be making a beeline for your website, annablackwell.co.uk, to read about these things in more detail, which you covered exceedingly well. Now, I just want to move on to a slightly different area, really, and just talk a sort of step back from these adventures, these ones we've talked about, and also the other ones that you've done before. And notice there have been changes when I've been talking to people, interviewing people over the last 12 months or so. So let's just talk about tech for a second. Now, would this trip, or those trips that we've been discussing, or any of the trips you've done, in fact, they have been feasible to do without tech?
Yes, definitely. Particularly the treks that I've done, the Kungsleden Green Ribbon, I avoided tech as best I could. So my phone is always on airplane mode, really, when I'm sort of in the more remote areas. I had maps for everything that I was doing and a compass always. And actually, I tried to use that as my main navigation. So if you know what you're doing and you're comfortable and confident using a map, then there's no reason to be reliant on carrying a phone. And yes, I had the GPS, and that was more sort of a backup in case of a real emergency. The kayaking trip, on the other hand, there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't do it without tech. We did rely on my phone quite a lot. We were using a satellite view on Google Maps every day to plan ahead, work out how far we could paddle that day before we reached a city, and whether we needed to stop before we would get to that city, how far it would be to get to the other side of it and find sort of some more open land where it would be better to camp. We were using it to work out how far until our next supermarket and things like that. We could have done it without the phone. We could have done it through talking to people, but actually we had sort of enough to be thinking about and a big enough challenge, and it was a safety net, and it did make things a lot more straightforward.
And I presume, once again, it also gave you an idea where you could pick up provisions, because obviously you weren't carrying everything with you on that particular kayak trip. You must have been picking up provisions as you went along. Yeah,
sort of buying food every week or 2 weeks.
So what's the tech that you actually carry with you then? I noticed from your pictures, it looks like you carry a Canon DSLR with you, and I think I read somewhere that you have an iPad and you do some editing while you're out, but have I misunderstood that?
No, so on the kayaking trip, we carried an iPad the whole way, so I was editing photos and writing blogs as we went. I started out on the Green Ribbon with the iPad, but ditched it in the first week when I travelled down to Stockholm, because I didn't want the weight of it, and also I just didn't really want the tech with me, and so I scrapped the iPad. I didn't literally scrap it. I gave it to my parents. Can't afford to scrap an iPad. So then for the Green Ribbon, I was down to my very heavy Canon DSLR and my phone, and I would occasionally on sort of my days off, I would edit a photo on my phone and update social media, and I was vlogging as well, so I'd put a video together on my phone, which is quite a challenge and quite gets a bit tedious as well.
So the camera then, was it sort of 35 to 70 lens that you took with you, or did you take a variety of lenses? Because obviously these things all add up, especially chargers and batteries and so on.
Yeah, I took a 24 to 70 mil lens, and that combined with my body, which is a 5D Mark IV, weighed, I think it's about 1.8 kilos, which is pretty heavy, and that's not including the charging and the spare batteries and memory cards.
And how many batteries did you take with you?
3. But I'm quite conservative with my battery use.
Yeah, but I noticed also that you have a solar power unit as well, or one of the fold-down flaps. Was that charging a battery pack, and then that in turn charged the camera? Sorry to sound so techie, but I know from experience all this stuff adds up and it starts to get bulky and heavy.
Yeah, so the solar panel I have isn't powerful enough to charge a camera, but I use it for my phone and the Garmin and a battery pack as well. I have a RAV Power one, which is fantastic, charges your phone up a couple of times. So I would use the solar panel to charge up either my phone directly or charge up the battery pack. But sadly not my camera, so I had to be conscious of how I was using my camera.
The Outdoors Station is a free media entertainment service dedicated to the self-powered outdoors enthusiast.
Well, I was just thinking with the length of that trek, how did you charge your batteries then on the Green Ribbon?
When I stopped off at mountain stations or had sort of, if I passed any sort of civilization, and that was generally every sort of 7 to 10 days on the whole, I would unpack my charging equipment and just sit there and buy a coffee if necessary. Actually, there was always buy cake if I had to. But quite often people were happy for me to sort of sit there and just charge things because they could see I was on a big trek.
So this leads me on to the next question, really, which is about you take on a trek, you seek sponsors, you're looking for publicity. Do you find the activity of committing yourself to doing the work for the sponsors, like taking the pictures of the products or the views or here I am doing so-and-so, actually takes away some of the pleasure from the trip? Because I know from experience, again, the admin you do in camp to keep all these people happy and write blogs or keep diaries or whatever it may be can be quite an onerous task.
Yeah, I think I've got to the stage now where I can actually strike quite a good balance. So on the kayaking expedition, I was very much committed to writing a blog every 7 to 10 days because we had a lot of people following it and I had a pressure from them, as in like I would get emails from people saying, where is the next blog? We're waiting. So I did sometimes feel a pressure, but we had days off every 7 to 10 days or every 2 weeks. And part of what that day off was for was writing the blog. So I kind of went into it knowing that that was going to be one of my tasks to do. Coming back from the kayaking expedition though, I had, I think, about 12 or 15 different blog posts and articles to write just about that trip. And by the time I had finished all of those, I was pretty sick of writing about it. So knowing that, when I went into the Green Ribbon, when I was approaching sponsors, I was much more careful about what I was committing to. So I didn't offer blogs, for example, because I knew that the having to write that many would take away the enjoyment of writing. And I do really, really love writing. So I write in my journal every single day religiously on adventures. I did commit to taking photos of sort of kit in use, which sometimes meant having to balance my camera on a rock in order to get a photo of the rucksack that I was using, for example. So that sort of things to take into consideration with sponsors, like how practical is it actually to get those photos. But at the end of the day, I quite like working with sponsors, so it's worth it for me.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Is there are many people that listen to your stories and listen to your adventures and the adventures of others as well, and wonder if it's feasible, if it's practical to actually be a full-time adventurer. Is it a financially viable pastime?
Yeah, if you're willing to put in the work. So I've been lucky to be supported on my last couple of ventures by sponsors, which means that I could do them in the first place because that just takes down the cost fantastically. The kayaking one especially, we had all of the costs covered as well. So we had about £15,000 of financial sponsorship, which meant that for the whole 5 months that we were away, we didn't have to spend any of our own money. Between adventures is where it gets harder because obviously you have to earn money to feed yourself and to pay rent. So I earn money through public speaking and writing, predominantly, and occasionally photography as well, or selling photos from trips. But that all does take a lot of hard work, and I have spent years building up enough of a profile, I guess, to be able to speak at different events. All of that said, I'm sort of taking a bit of a break from it at the moment because I've started this master's and have decided to sort of focus on that quite a lot. So I haven't really done any public speaking about the Green Ribbon, which I miss because I really like telling my stories and sharing my experiences.
Does that also mean then when you tell your stories and share the enthusiasm and details about this, and people obviously ask you questions about doing it and have an indication they might try to do something similar, do you feel you have also an environmental responsibility not only to tread lightly yourself, but also to encourage people to consider the environment rather than just go rushing in and buying the kit and just rushing off to Sweden or whatever and not really thinking about the impact they're making?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, this was one of the big things that I tried to think about more with the Green Ribbon. So if you go on my website and look at the companies that sponsored me, a lot of them have a really, really good environmental policy, and they're very sustainable. So I was sponsored by like Paramo, for example, and all of their waterproofing, it's PFC free, so you don't have these like really harmful chemicals. And Firepot Food, who gave me a lot of my dehydrated meals, they offer compostable packaging, so it's plastic free packaging. So I really tried to, and it's something I'm continuing to do as well, is trying to approach and only work with companies who are either sustainable in the products that they make or are taking really, really good steps to offsetting or supporting other environmental campaigns. But also it comes down to like the travel as well, because so often going off on big trips involves going really far away. So I flew to Sweden, but once I was in Sweden, instead of taking a short-ish internal flight up to the Arctic to start my trek, I spent about 40 hours on buses and trains, and I'd found a website that could calculate how the carbon footprint of flying, and then calculated it for a journey using buses and trains, and worked out that it was a little bit better to do this really long journey using public transport. And those were all things that I shared through this journey in particular, sort of promoting these companies and sort of flagging things up. And I have noticed since getting back, if I'm doing some sort of campaign or I'm partnering with a brand, whenever I promote the sustainable aspects of them, it gets a lot more engagement from people. I get more people commenting or messaging me saying, oh, that's really interesting, like I want more of this, or I didn't know that sort of technology existed, and I didn't know you could get that particular garment using these recycled fabrics and things like that. So I feel like I have a responsibility with a following who hopefully pay attention to what I say sometimes, to promote these things and make people stop and think about whether there is a way that they could go on adventures, do adventurous travel in a more environmentally friendly way.
And literally listening to that, it immediately comes to mind is one thing to actually research and work out how you're going to get from A to B in the start and do the trip itself. But the actual research to find these sponsors must itself be quite considerable. Yeah,
but I love it. I'm definitely a kit geek. I love researching things, and I have like countless spreadsheets for everything. And so that I get a lot of reward out of that bit of it as well. I love planning and preparing for the adventures almost as much as I love doing them, but it does take a lot of time.
And let's go on to another quick question then. Of all the kit that you've used and the varieties of ways that you've used it, what would you like to see improved? What kit would you or invented to solve a particular problem?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Clothing, tents, sleeping, shelter, cooking, anything?
The one thing that constantly annoys me is that I get a really cold bum in my sleeping bag. No matter how good my sleeping bag is, and I use a sleeping bag, the comfort rating is -12, and I will use that in England in the autumn, for example. Whole body's fine, my bum's freezing cold. So I think companies need to put more down around the bum area.
Is it a female-specific bag that you're using?
Yeah. Well, this one isn't, but I've had the same case in my female-specific Rab one. Naming and shaming.
There's a challenge for people. And the other thing would be looking back at what you've done. I mean, you say taking a full frame DSLR, which in itself I think is an achievement. But is there anything that you could do to make your trip more enjoyable by reducing the weight, making it lighter at all?
For the Green Ribbon, no, actually. I really thought about everything that I was taking, with the exception of the iPad to start with. That was the only thing really that I ditched, and I did have opportunities to sort of get rid of other items along the way and post them back, and I never did, because every item that I had was either served a practical purpose and I needed it for that, or it gave me so much pleasure, like my DSLR, regardless of whether or not I have sort of sponsors involved. I pretty much always will carry that camera because I love taking photos and I love having them afterwards as well. But that also is, I've sort of refined my kit over the years, and through doing the Kungsleden and other sort of treks in the UK as well, or multi-day hikes, I've refined what I carry, so I know that everything I have is going to do a good job and sort of be sufficient.
So what would you say would be your one single luxury item? And you can't say a block of chocolate.
Ooh, Kindle, my e-reader.
Oh, you take one of those as well? That's interesting.
I do, yeah, because I'm a prolific reader, particularly on treks like this. Bear in mind that at the end of, towards the end of the Green Ribbon, it was sort of getting dark at 5 or 6, and then you're alone in the middle of nowhere in a tent. You're not quite tired yet. So I read about 20 books, I think, possibly more than that while I was away. And that just offers so much companionship and entertainment.
Yes, well, I totally agree. I did exactly the same thing, actually. I had a recent trip in Scotland and I had to spend 24 hours in a pouring rain storm stuck in a tent, and I did enjoy my Kindle. It would have driven me nuts otherwise. So, which leads on to the final question, which is, of all the things I could have asked you about your series of adventures and trips, what should I have asked you?
Ooh, that's another really good question. I'm really having to think about this. So I've enjoyed this.
Take as long as you like.
Okay, what was the biggest mental challenge? Or what is, on adventures like this, what's the biggest mental challenge? Because often there's a lot of focus on the physical challenge of it and the weight of the rucksack that you carry and the size of the mountains or the ascent or the distance. But there's always less attention given to the mental challenges.
And what would your answer be?
Overcoming the monotony of trekking through constant cloud and rain for weeks.
Simple as that.
Yeah, it gets very, very monotonous and tedious. And when you have absolutely no view, because often on a long distance trek where every single day you are doing the same thing, you are walking, you're camping, you're having something to eat, going to sleep, next day, walking, camping. The big things are what's going on around you. And if all that is going on around you is white cloud and soggy, boggy ground, that can really, really wear down on you. So developing tactics and ways to entertain yourself and stay positive through that, actually, I think is one of the biggest challenges.
Well, it's December 2019 as we record this, and you hinted just before we started the conversation that you were off to the Arctic in January. Are you doing another trek there?
It's a short trip, actually. I have a friend who's working as a Northern Lights photography guide up there, so I'm going to visit him for 10 days, and we're going to be doing some snowshoeing and ski touring and camping out under the Northern Lights. So it's more of a holiday than anything. But I have some big ideas for post-masters, so next autumn 2020 onwards, but I'm not going to say any more.
I do hope you enjoyed this conversation with Anna, and my thanks must go to her for taking the time to detail her story with such enthusiasm. If you feel others might like to hear it too, please share the links to this podcast around your outdoor network. There's so many ways to listen these days, not only downloading or iTunes, but you can stream, you can Spotify, you can even listen on Alexa. All the links are over on the website, theoutdoorstation.co.uk. While you're there, why not join our newsletter and perhaps suggest others who may have an adventure story for others to hear too. In the meantime, keep an eye out on the Outdoors Station social media for my From the Archives series, where I'm re-releasing links to some classic conversations I've had over the years, which I feel are still relevant. There's lots going on for 2020, and I've already recorded several interviews for your delectation. So, stay tuned, please share our story, and I'll see you next time. Until then, bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To hear or see more from our extensive free library, please visit theoutdoorstation.co.uk.